And welcome to the second meeting in 2025 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. We have apologies this morning from Michelle Thompson. The first item on our agenda today is to take evidence on the Scottish Budget 25-26 from two panels of witnesses. First, we hear from the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body on its own budget bid before taking evidence from the Cabinet Secretary of Finance and Local Government. I now move to our first panel of witnesses. Jackson Carlott MSP, member of the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body, is joined today by Scottish Parliamentary officials, David McGill, Clark Chief Executive, and Sarah Glass, Director of Finance and Resilience. I'd like to welcome you all to the meeting, and I intend to allow around 75 minutes for the session. And I now invite Mr Carlott to make a short opening statement. Jackson.
Thank you very much, Convener. It's my favourite time of the year. It's lovely to be back with you again, and as customary, I'll make a brief opening statement and set the context for the Corporate Body's 25-26 budget and set out some key points. This budget bid is the fourth and final of our medium-term financial plan for Session 6 and is aligned to the commitments made in the 22-23 submission, which focused on setting up the Scottish Parliamentary Service for the challenges of Session 6. In the context of tightening public sector finance, our focus on this submission has been on ensuring strong financial governance and driving value for money whilst continuing to drive our strategic priorities and protect services in this, which will be a very busy final year of Session 6. In summary, the total proposed budget for 25-26 of £136.2 million represents a rather large net £9.7 million or 7.6% increase on the current financial year's budget and £2.8 million or 2.1% increase on the indicative 25-26 budget previously advised to the Finance and Public Administration Committee. Our ambition was to submit a 25-26 budget bid which was below the 25-26 indicative. This has been achieved but for the controllable elements of our budget, which are in fact 0.6 million lower than the indicative. However, changes to national insurance forced through by the Westminster Government have cost an additional £1.9 million, and unforeseen additional costs from the Electoral Commission, responsibilities of which have transferred to Parliament, of £2.1 million, though partially offset by the delayed appointment of a Patient Safety Commissioner, mean that our headline budget is above indicative by £2.8 million. The overall increase of 7.6% above the 25-26 budget is primarily driven by inflation, those changes to employers' national insurance costs, and the unforeseen costs, additional costs from the Electoral Commission. The review of services contracts and operational practices, which we introduced during last year's discussion, has driven cost savings which are reflected in the 25-26 bid. For MSPs and ministerial salaries, I can confirm that since we broke the link in pay with Westminster in 2015 until 23-24, we had consistently used ASH as our index as set out in the scheme. The scheme allows the SPCB to use the annual survey of hours and earnings index, known as ASH, as our index, or such other index as the corporate body may consider or deem appropriate. So in 24-25, after a lot of reflection, the corporate body chose to apply the average weekly earnings index, AWE, as we really felt the ASH index had become misaligned with other wage inflation indices over the previous few years. And this misalignment has actually continued in 25-26, albeit now in completely the opposite way. Latest publications report ASH mean is 6.7% compared to AWE at 3.2% and CPI at 1.7%. But we do intend to continue to apply the AWE index this year. Very much I've used the metaphor, I don't think the corporate body should bounce around like bumblebees in a bottle. We have to apply a consistent methodology. Picking an index is not just to say go and pick the one that's highest. We have to have a consistent approach to this, and that is the approach we've chosen for the duration of this session. The application of AWE at 3.2 equates to a salary of £74,506 in 25-26. Changes to employers' national insurance are also reflected in the cost of members' pay. Turning to staff cost provision for last year's budget 24-25 and in 23-24, the corporate body also chose AWE to uplift the staff cost provision in a move away from our previous basket approach of indexing staff cost provision annually using a mix of AWE and that same ASH index that had proved to be unreliable. And that had been adopted since the budget in 21-22. In selecting the 25-26 uprating index, the corporate bodies expressed a preference to continue with AWE until the end of this session. Applying AWE for staff cost provision is consistent with the index selected for members' pay at a rate of 3.2%. This would mean a rate of £162,000 per member. The budget submission includes this assumption. The changes to national insurance are also reflected in the bid as an additional cost on the staff provision. Parliament's staff budget maintains the staffing baseline as agreed in 22-23, with the 25-26 budget bid upgraded to take account of the previously agreed 2-year pay award. The changes again to employers' national insurance are again reflected in the bid as an additional cost in the staffing budget. Following a prioritisation exercise, the total amount incorporated in the 25-26 budget for revenue and capital projects is £6.3 million, which is a £1 million increase on 24-25. Forecast spend on the election project accounts for £0.7 million of this increase, alongside a marginal inflationary increase. In our submission, we highlight a number of major projects in Schedule 3 which are underway or due to commence in 25-26. The 2 new major projects starting in 25-26 are the lobbying register replacement, which is a replacement of the system that provides the external website, database and workflows necessary to administer the register, which was introduced following an Act of Parliament in 2018 and the 2026 Scottish Parliament election project. The office holders' 25-26 budget submissions total £21.4 million, which is £3.1 million, 17% higher than the current year, and £1.7 million, 8.6% higher than the indicative. The main changes in these budgets from the 24-25 reflect additional costs in the Electoral Commission of £2.1 million, inflation and the impact of changes of employer national insurance contributions of £0.2 million. The additional £2.1 million Electoral Commission costs relate to election activities in advance of the May 2026 election, and they should have been included in last year's indicative budget. As the committee knows, the SPCB carefully scrutinises the office holder bids and challenge if no clear justification for the increase has been given, and there are examples of our having done so again during the last financial year and in anticipation of the budget bids for the forthcoming year. The corporate body welcomes the conclusions and recommendations from this committee's strategic review of the commissioner landscape. I think something we flagged up, very much welcome the work that you have done. We welcome the establishment of the new committee as a result of this committee's report, and we look forward as a corporate body to working with this new committee and supporting its important work in the months ahead. In terms of proposals for new commissioners, we note that the Parliament agreed to a moratorium while the new committee undertakes its work, but also note that there are potentially 3 commissioners very much in the works at present. We continue to include a contingency provision of £1 million to cover any emerging priorities or unforeseen issues. And, sorry, Convener, but as always, it takes longer than I thought it was going to, but that concludes the opening remarks.
No, that's comprehensive. I mean, in actual fact, when you do these opening statements, it makes life easier for the committee because it answers some of the questions that we would probably be asking anyway, but of course it also leads to others. And I think the most obvious question that anyone would ask is with regard to the Electoral Commission, the fact why wasn't that £2 million included in the indicative costs going forward? Because, I mean, it's pretty obvious that there's going to be an election next year, so it seems bizarre that it's not actually included in the indicative cost for 25-26.
It is a cost that kind of fell between 2 stools. It's a transfer of responsibility to this Parliament. Yeah. It is an indicative cost. I mean, it would have been in the previous budget one way or the other, but David, do you want to just explain why we felt that that hadn't happened?
Yeah, and we can only apologise for that. It was an error that comes from the fact that the corporate body has only had responsibility for the Electoral Commission's spending for one complete cycle. So this is the first time we will get to the cycle which is just in front of an election. It should have been there. The Electoral Commission didn't put it in its submission last year, and we failed to spot that it wasn't there. So, as Jackson Carlaw has said, it doesn't change the overall amount, but it certainly should have been flagged to the committee this time last year.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I mean, if we actually look at office holders and we ignore the fact that there are others in the pipeline. What we look actually, when we look at the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman, we see a 6.7% increase in budget. Scottish Information Commissioner 6.3%. Human Rights 6.9%, Standards and Ethical Life 5.2%, even Biometrics 6%. So what we're seeing is we're still seeing significant increases above inflation in terms of the bid for those. I just wonder if you can explain why that is the case.
Yeah, if we look at the budget as a whole rather than by individual office holders, you'll see that overall figure is 3.1 million, which is a big number. As we've just explained, 2.1 million of that is applicable to the Electoral Commission's costs. The other costs break down as pay and progression. The office holder staff are all on the same terms and conditions as Scottish Parliament staff. That accounts for £560,000. The changes to national insurance contributions, that's another £200,000. There was a rent increase at Bridgeside House where 4 of the office holders are located, and we hope to put at least one more office holder in there. That was £144,000. So that's the breakdown. The corporate body has either no or little control over these elements.
Yeah, it's just that, I mean, some of it is clearly in terms of salary, and you talked about those increases, but our own staff salary increase is going to be 3.2%, so it looks like MSP's own staff will be held to a lower level of increase than, well, any of the office holders other than, for example, the Standards Commission for Scotland, which is 2.8%.
Yeah, the staff award for the staff of office holders is in line with the Scottish Parliament staff, which is 3.8%, which is the second year of a 2-year pay deal. But that also, the figure that you have there also includes the changes to national insurance contributions, so it's not just the 3.8%.
Right, okay. Now, one of the interesting things about office holders is we received reports from committees in terms of their office holder responsibility, and it looks as if there is a kind of we don't have time to scrutinise these effectively collective view from those. And in fact, even the Ombudsman actually suggests that this committee actually undertakes scrutiny of the Ombudsman. I'm just wondering how you feel about the level of scrutiny, given the fact that, for example, this £2 million in the Electoral Commission wasn't identified.
I think we have in the last year, following our meeting, in fact, with this committee and the work that we hope very much that you would initiate, have stepped up the scrutiny that we are applying to the office holders as well. Clearly, for the corporate body, a significant increase in the number of office holders has meant that that is actually a challenge for us too. We looked at different ways of doing it. We wondered about whether or not we could even set up a separate committee to look at that. But in fact, the way in which standing orders are framed and everything proved that that wasn't a way that we could proceed. In consequence, we are now almost at every meeting of the corporate body in recent times meeting with the individual office holders and have got a programme in place where we will be meeting and scrutinising the work that they do on a more regular basis. In consequence of that, we have turned down requests that have been made in this financial year for potentially the route of external consultants, or in the case of the Scottish Human Rights Commission, looking ahead at bids that they'd made in anticipation of parliamentary bills, took the view that we would very much wait and see what Parliament's view of the bill was before we allowed those additional increases to come forward. Our problem, of course, is always that our responsibility is to ensure that the will of Parliament is properly reflected in the actual ability of the office holders to perform their governance functions. It's for the individual committees to scrutinise the detailed work that they do.
Okay.
David,
Sorry, I just wanted to add that you recall that we did reach agreement with the committees in relation to a written agreement which set out the division of roles between the corporate body, which is governance oversight, and the committees, which is performance oversight. I don't think we've quite got to a situation yet that's fit for purpose, so we were in the process of reviewing that written agreement when the new committee was established. And we're really hopeful that that committee will pick up these issues so that we can get to a situation which better reflects the parliamentary scrutiny that we all want to see of office holders. And just finally to add that the office holders themselves have indicated that they would welcome that increased scrutiny, so it's not that we're pushing against any opposition from that source.
Yeah, I think they might welcome increased scrutiny, and I'm sure the Parliament would as well, but it's who actually does it. I mean, if we've got an increased number of commissioners, how close to capacity is the SPCB in terms of your scrutiny? Because the committees are saying, hold on, we're kind of we are really at capacity. This committee, I don't think, could scrutinise all of these commissioners, especially if more coming on the pipeline. So where are we in terms of that?
Well, I think the corporate body feels it's pretty close to capacity, if not already exceeded capacity. There is the opportunity for the corporate body to hold additional meetings in due course if that was required. But I certainly think were the additional 3 commissioners that are envisaged to be forthcoming, it would be very difficult for the corporate body actually to do justice to the rest of the agenda of work that it has in relation to the whole parliamentary campus, and also to spend meaningful time with the commissioners and engage with them. I mean, when the commissioners come in, and David is correct, I mean, I think they have welcomed the fact that they have been invited to come in and meet us, but we have to do justice to that engagement, and that takes up time, and that time obviously is potentially at the expense of our ability as a corporate body to scrutinise many of the other important matters that come before it. At the moment, I think we're managing, but I think we all feel we're pretty much at the edge of being able to say that we are doing that effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's maybe something that the new committee it's looking at. Commissioners will have to obviously address as part of its own remit. I'll go back to the issue of the AWE versus ASH situation. It seems to be in terms of MSPs. I know my colleagues will be dead keen to get involved in this particular issue, but so I suppose as convener I shall. You know, it's a kind of heads we lose and tails we lose, isn't it, really, I suppose, for because the ASH index, when it came out a couple of years ago, was about 1.7%, when inflation was 11%. And Jackson, you said with a twinkle in your eye that next year it will probably reverse. It didn't really, and now it's went the other way. So we're in a situation whereby MSP salaries have gone up 12% in the last 5 years compared to 25% inflation. So I'm just wondering why you decided, you know, was it just for public consumption reasons or for other reasons, financial reasons, whatever, that you decided that you would just say, do you know what, let's just stick with AWE?
I said in my opening remarks, and I genuinely believe that we shouldn't bounce around like bumblebees in a bottle. I mean, I don't think we can just take the view as a responsible corporate body that will look at the various indices and see which one is the highest and say, oh, that's a nice one for us to pick. So we were very...
Sorry, I don't think anyone would agree with that. I think
so
I'll
follow through.
Consistency throughout the Parliament, one way or the other, and that's not happened.
So we stayed with ASH up to a point, and we have looked at what the cumulative effect of all of this is, and I actually think that the action we've taken has led over the piece to a reasonable position, Sarah?
It has for the staff cost provision, but not for MSP pay.
And we are acutely aware of that. You will possibly be aware that, relatively speaking, the hierarchy of parliaments was Westminster, Scottish Parliament, and then the Welsh Synod. And at some point in time, the Welsh Synod members exceeded the remuneration of Scottish Parliament members. They applied a 3% pay cap, which meant that the relativity between the parliaments was about to be restored. This year they decided to abandon the pay cap and decided that they would embrace ASH, which means that the relativity is not going to be restored. I think it's for this corporate body, as we are reviewing, you're aware, because all parliamentary groups and individuals have been invited to contribute to a review of expenses and remuneration. It is for this corporate body to look at all of this and to potentially reflect on that ahead of recommendations we might make in respect to the next session.
Now, I mean, obviously staff is also 3.2% in the forthcoming year, which means it's difficult, obviously, to have in-grade promotions, for example, for advancement for staff members, I would suggest. Why is it you decided to abandon the ASH-AWE combo for staff?
I think for the reasons we gave before, that the reason that we did abandon it was because the AWE figure was more reliable, and incorporating ASH into the basket was actually depressing it. And I think, as Sarah said, over the piece, had we not moved to AWE, it would actually have led to a negative reduction in the overall package for staff.
Yes, so over the last 3 years, because we moved away when when ash was at its lowest and we switched out of the basket and into just AWE, it means that over a 3-year cumulative, even though this year obviously ash is higher again, the staff cost provision the uplift has been higher cumulatively than it would have been had we stayed with the basket, about 0.5%.
Okay. Well, I suppose we'll be happy with that. I would certainly hope. Moving on to something else, in terms of staff numbers, parliamentary staff numbers, you've said that the SPCB remains committed to maintaining the staff baseline agreed in 22-23 throughout Session 6. And you talk about a couple of posts added in security to deliver a new service to monitor social media activity, referencing MSPs, with this increase being largely offset by the reductions across permanent staff complement. But there's an overall change to staff numbers. Can you tell us what this social media referencing monitoring service is?
It's something that we picked up from Police Scotland in relation to the monitoring that they do of individual social media feeds, which there's a piece of software that identifies patterns of behaviour where threats have been issued to individuals, and it has a reporting mechanism attached to it as well. So we work with Police Scotland in relation to the monitoring that goes on in individual accounts to identify patterns of behaviour. And over the course of the pilot that we ran for about a year, we identified several thousand posts that were of note, and of those, about 500 were considered to pass the threshold for criminal activity. And I think we've recently just secured our second conviction in relation to those. So it's about really improving the support and the protection that we give to elected representatives as they go about their duties.
Is this as a result of kind of incidents like the murders of David Amos and Joe
It's
Cox?
exactly that, yes. It was to make sure that we were responding to that in what we saw as a proportionate but sensible way as well.
Okay. I think there's been a significant increase in the number of members taking advantage of the service as well.
Yeah, the pilot was originally about 20 members, I think, but the demand has been really quite significant. So I think we're up to about 70 or 80 members who are signed up to be part of the monitoring service.
Okay, thanks. That's very interesting. I'm not one of them, so I'm particularly interested in it. One thing I was going to ask with regard to staff numbers about keeping the complement the same is that my understanding is that there was a significant uplift in staff numbers at that time because of the having to adapt to post-Brexit arrangements. Are we still wading through those? Have they been resolved? And if so, do we still need the same number of staff to be dealing with that issue?
I think we are still dealing with the post-Brexit situation, but it's settled down into a business-as-usual pattern. But I think a lot of the staff uplift that we had back then in relation to the Brexit changes were about what we'd inherited as a result. It wasn't just managing the process of change, it was about making sure that the Parliament was able to scrutinise in the new environment. So these were permanent changes to account for the new constitutional setup that the Parliament found itself in.
Okay, thank you. Now, one of the things we said last year in a report was that we recommended that the SPCB, and I quote, focus on optimising value for money in its budgetary decisions and delivery. As part of next year's budget bid, we would therefore like to see additional information on how the SPCB makes the most effective use of its funds, including setting out where savings have been identified and how projects have been prioritised. But as the presiding officer says in her letter to us, the annual report does not specifically identify savings or sets out how projects have been prioritised. So why not?
In the bid submission, we in both the letter and in Schedule 3, we refer to cost savings, which have a total of £100,000 in this budget bid. These are the first recommendations and commitments from a programme of work which we first introduced last year when we came in front of you. The framing of that work is important. So there are some key principles that we've held ourselves to. So we will continue to take medium-term strategic perspective when considering any cost savings, any cost reduction opportunities. We are committed to the staffing baseline that we bid for in 22-23. That's a firm commitment for the duration of this session. So that's a principle. Similarly with the members' expenses scheme, and we also have a no compulsory redundancy guarantee. And I guess that then has that shapes what we can tackle the cost areas that are in focus. Approximately 70% of our cost base is people, so that's £97 million across the various staffing groups. And within people costs, we have reasonably significant cost savings already baked in. So we budget for the parliamentary staff, we budget with what we call a vacancy gap. So we have a 5% vacancy gap, and that's equivalent to £2 million. So we essentially are seeking to always run with 5% lower staffing, and that's a budgetary mechanic to keep us tight control. So that £2 million's baked in. And similarly, within the staff cost provision, there's a 7% equivalent, and that also saves £1.4 million. So they're in the base. Other chunks of our cost base are relatively fixed. Rates, office cost provision, which provides office for all our members. So we've really focused on either sort of discretionary cost areas or areas where contracts are coming up for renewal, and we've got the opportunity to negotiate better costs, and that's where some of those savings have come from. The 100k that are in this year, there's 60,000 in IT cost savings, a variety of areas, some contractual, some changes in terms of the service offering. We've got 30,000 in training, so we've moved to a new managed learning service. So previously, all different areas had their own training budgets and they would source their own training themselves. Now we've contracted with one supplier and all the training requirements are channelled through there, so we're getting much better value for money. And also we've been really robust on our travel and expenses, so we've reduced that. That's requiring quite a lot of difficult choices to be made. So that's got some savings that are committed in this year's budget. The work continues, so we'll continue to look for further opportunities, some of it more in the contractual areas, which will open up as they come round for relet. It's not possible to do that in the shorter term. So in terms of actual cost savings, that's what's committed to in terms of this budget. There's always prioritisation, both within the resourcing and also within the projects. So I guess from a resource deployment perspective, the new committee that's formed needs staff to support it. That's about £200,000 of cost for those simply entirely dedicated to it, and that's been found from other areas. And then within projects, we have a long list of projects which were bid for and haven't been funded in the budget. They may end up being funded in due course, but they haven't been.
But that's why it'd be helpful to see why some are prioritised and some are not. In terms of the report, it's the same as savings. It would be good to have more specifics on those. I mean, if we actually look at some of the projects to be funded, for example, there's a net zero ready project worth £926,000. And that is £736,000 on building and environmental management system programme, and net zero consultancy is going to be £190,000. So it would be good to see what that's actually going to deliver, for example. At the moment, we've just got lists of projects, but it doesn't really say what they're necessarily what they're going to actually do. I mean, I'm not looking for war and peace, I think, but a sentence or two to give the specifics on that would probably be very helpful.
I did think, Convener, last year we offered you an exclusive tour of the bowels of the building in order that you could actually go and see the building energy management system personally, touch and feel what it is that we are having to invest in replacing. I don't know whether the committee felt it wanted to take advantage of that wonderful opportunity.
I don't even recall being not offered to, I have to be honest, but I mean, so apologies on that front, clearly, but maybe that's something that members will take up. I mean, it's something we'll certainly discuss afterwards. One of the projects, of course, has changed to the business bulletin, forecast at £378,000. This to me is starting to move into, upgraded website territory, not quite in terms of money, but why would you spend £378,000 changing the business bulletin?
Yeah, so the business bulletin is not supported anymore in its the current system, and there's lots of, so whilst I think maybe from a user perspective it seems to perform the functions that it's needed to, I think the amount of running around in the background and sticky tape and whatever that's required to hold it together and get it there is unsustainable. So it is out of support and it needs to be replaced, but there's also lots of opportunity to make it more efficient for the staff that are involved in pulling it all together. So,
So will that ultimately lead to savings then?
it will free up staff to
People are running around all the time.
It'll free up staff to work on other things, I guess, is the or in time it could drive out savings, but that, I guess, that's the opportunity. But yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. We've got all colleagues wish to ask questions. So the first to come in will be Craig, to follow by Ross.
Good morning. I suppose just in headline terms, that the indicative budget for 2025 shows the cost of Parliament rising to nearly £150 million. That's up from £100 million at the start of this term. It's a significant rise. Is it one that's justifiable to taxpayers?
An interesting question. When I joined the corporate body and replaced my late friend and colleague Alex Johnson in 2016, the cost of running the Parliament was about £70 million. So by the end of this term, it will have doubled. And as you point out, it's a significant increase in this session alone, from around £100 million to potentially £147 million next year. Part of that is, of course, external additional responsibilities that have been added to the life of the Parliament rather than organic growth of expense within the Parliament itself. We've touched on some of those this morning, and we can also see the increasing relative cost of the office holders that you have set, the committee has been set up to, as an overall percentage of our budget increasing too. I think it's something we have to be acutely aware of as politicians collectively, that is the additional expense that the Parliament and operating the Parliament with all the responsibilities that have been added to it represents. And it's not a question, I think, for the corporate body to determine whether or not that's value for money. I think that's very much one for MSPs to consider and reflect in the job that they do. Sarah?
Yeah. I mean, in that 147, which is the indicative for 26-27, there is about £10 million, which is one-off election costs. So, we're not quite at the breaching for the kind of core running. We're not quite at the 150. It's about 10 million lower than that in terms of that core. But we've got one-off costs for the election in that 1 year.
Okay. And in terms of sort of staff pay, you would understand that a nation's Parliament wants to be seen as a fair employer. How do we benchmark some of the salaries within this building against those outside?
Yes, so our people services team do regular benchmarking of the various roles that exist within the profile for your staff, and the same will be done again as part of the review of the scheme in advance of the next session. So we're assured that at the moment the benchmarks are in line, but a full review will be conducted as part of the review of the staff cost provision for the next session.
Sorry, David.
I want to say that we did 2 benchmarking exercises in the recent past, and both of those reports are published and available on the intranet. We can make them available to you or the committee if you would find that helpful.
Yeah, I'm sure that would be. It may be getting a little granular, but just I looked at the shop trading accounts for the Parliament, and I've got 2 comments in relation to that, questions. One was in relation to direct salaries, which have sort of bounced around a little bit, but are now £126,000 a year, which seems to account for 1 manager plus 1 1/3 support staff in the shop. So it's 2.3 times individuals. The 1.33, so the 1 1/3, are on grade 2, which is a salary of 30 to 33,000 presently. That seems to be about 25 to 30% more than the average retail salary. Would there be a reason as to why, for example, those salaries don't seem to be aligned with those outside the Scottish Parliament in the broader retail sector?
Yeah, I mean, all our staff are on consistent pay scales, irrespective of which part of the organisation they work in. So whilst our grade 2s that work in the shop, they're remunerated in exactly the same way and benchmarked in the same way that our other grade 2s are. So, yeah, no, we recognise that we're not benchmarking against the retail sector in terms of our pay rates for.
So there's an
those
internal
staff.
benchmarking almost within the Scottish Parliament.
Yeah, I mean, they are all employees of the Scottish Parliament and therefore are employed consistently within the pay scales of the Scottish Parliament.
Fine. Okay, and then just looking at, obviously, another labour-related cost is the unexpected, I think is probably the best description of the national insurance increase that was imposed by the Labour government, which appears to be costing the Parliament £2 million this year. This has obviously been played out throughout the public and private sectors, which is a considerable concern to both. How concerned are you that this is adding to significant costs to the budget for the forthcoming year? And is there any further way you can look to savings, be that in relation to Labour or broadly through the rest of the Parliament, to make up for this unexpected expenditure?
I'm trying to be neutrally political in respect of the corporate body in regard to this. Obviously, it was a totally unforeseen additional cost for the Scottish Parliament to have to bear. And, of course, the only way in which it can be met is by the taxpayer and the funding of the Scottish Parliament. But obviously, at £1.9 million, it is a very considerable additional burden on the taxpayer in order that we can all be here.
Yeah. And just, you mentioned the situation in the Welsh Senate in relation to the differentials there. There's also within the Scottish local government arena at the moment, SLARC, which is looking at potentially raising councillors' salaries. And I think anybody who's been a councillor will realise that it's a very, very tough job and perhaps the remuneration is not sufficient. But it obviously does mean that council leaders in some local authorities in Scotland will be earning the same as MSPs. Given that differentials seem to be quite a contentious issue right throughout both public and private sectors, would you anticipate that having any consequences in relation to ongoing discussion around MSP pay in future, the fact that the gap with councillors will close?
Well, gosh, I'm reminded of the phrases "fools rush in where angels fail to tread" in relation to trying to value judgments with councillors. I think what the corporate body has been doing has been looking at the overall relative packages between the different parliamentarians here and in the Republic of Ireland. We've looked very much at the resettlement figure, about the pension arrangements, about the broader expenses portfolio, as well as the remuneration. And as I pointed out earlier on, I think that we do have an underlying concern that the relative position of MSPs has declined, but perhaps not just as obviously as the headline figure might be if you looked exclusively at frontline remuneration. But nonetheless, that's an ongoing review. We looked at it in detail the summer before last, had an update this last summer, had believed things were moving in a particular direction. That may not now necessarily be the case, so it's something that the corporate body will continue to reflect upon during the course of this final year of the Parliament.
I'm just looking at Senate members' pay and conditions. And as a former opposition leader, Mr Jackson, you might want to be careful how you answer this question. But opposition party leaders in the Senate receive an additional payment for those responsibilities. Is that something that the corporate body has considered in relation to Scottish Parliament's opposition leaderships?
My understanding is that right back at the establishment of the Parliament, this was looked at, and that in fact opposition leaders at that time declined to take any personal additional remuneration and asked that that funding be put instead into the general resource that was available to the political parties in short money. So that was my understanding at the time. Having said that, I think that, again, this is a matter which the review which is underway should take into account, because, albeit briefly, but certainly as somebody who served as a party leader, I am aware that the responsibilities on party leaders of all parties in this Parliament now seem to me to be greater than was probably the case at the point when the Parliament was established. And it is the case that some of those responsibilities are being funded out of the personal pocket of the individual who is acting in the capacity as leader of their party. And I don't think that is actually fair or reasonable. But these are matters which are currently being subject to the general review which the corporate body initiated in relation to the overall expenses and remuneration portfolio.
That is, of course, provided they don't have a wealthy donor who buy their glasses and suits, of course. But I don't need to comment on that. That's just one technical question. It may be my lack of understanding here. On Schedule 5, the SPCB Statement of Financial Position, just two questions in relation to that. One is the non-current assets, Hollywood Land and Buildings, which rises to the capital value to 407 million this year from 401 last year. I was just wondering, is there a particular reason? Because I think there's only £1 million of capital expenditure this year, so presumably is that just market conditions? Or?
Sarah?
Yeah, every year so on a cycle we have full valuation, and on the years in between we do a desktop valuation based on inputs, and that's just the application of the desktop valuation. There's a full building revaluation due in the next year.
Okay, fine. And then just lastly, just if you look at the current assets and current liabilities, the cash and cash equivalents and the liabilities are static. It's the same number for 24, 25 and 26. I was just wondering if that's a particular reason for that. It just sort of jumped out at me.
I'd need to come back to you on why it's precisely the same.
Yeah, it's exactly, yeah. That's why I thought. Super. Thanks very much.
Craig prompted me to recall something. In 2000, when John Swinney was Leader of the Opposition, he turned down a £21,000 salary increase as Leader of the Opposition, only to have a week later a double-page spread in the newspaper about how his office was spending £3,000 on furniture and computers. So we get no credit, effectively, for turning down that salary increase, and then get slagged off for buying equipment for his office. So it's this kind of hair-shut approach doesn't necessarily go down particularly well, and doesn't get appreciated. What I was going to say was, in terms of the salary thing, just have ministers again for the 18th year refused, or 17th year, whatever it is, refused a pay rise, or have they finally decided to accept a pay rise this year? Are you aware of that yet, corporate body? And what does that mean, if anything, for the corporate body?
Yeah, we haven't been informed yet what the decision is for this year. We're presuming that it still stands, but for the corporate body, the way in which the salaries are still issued and then they're taken back, is that correct, Sarah? Yeah, so the corporate body will pay out the funds, but they're automatically returned to the centre. So we will implement that process if that's what the decision is for this year.
And how much is that worth in the current year?
I don't have that figure. I'm not sure that Sarah does either, but we can get that to the committee. It should be an easy calculation to make.
Okay, thanks very much. Sorry, Ross, followed by Michael.
Thanks, Convener. Just to return to some of the questions around, around staff cost provision, I should refer to my register of interest in that I'm a member of the NUJ, which is one of the unions that also represents MSP staff and that's made representation to the corporate body. The joint letter that you received from the GMB, the NUJ and the PGSU took issue with the decision to move purely to AWE as opposed to the basket of measures. In the first instance, could you just outline a little bit what level of engagement the corporate body has with staff unions, both representing parliamentary corporate staff but also the MSP staff unions, ahead of a decision like that?
I think it's important to state that we are responsible for selecting an indus which will increase the provision that is made, but we are not the employer of the staff concerned. Individual MSPs are the employers of their staff, and therefore the corporate body does not believe that it is appropriate for us to enter into detailed discussions, although the Chief Executive has entered into an exchange of correspondence in relation to these matters. In relation to the decision we took about the indus, it was, as we illustrated earlier, that we moved away from the basket because we felt it was prejudicial to the overall increase that was going to be available to MSPs in relation to the fund that they would then have to determine the salaries of their staff. And it's also important, I think, to point out that there is an underutilisation of the staff cost provision there are a considerable number of members who fall well short of the actual spend that is available to them. So there is definitely capacity within all of that for some of the different salary remuneration increases individuals might want to obtain. David?
Yeah, I was just going to say that for the last 3 years, I think I've met face-to-face with staff representing the unions. Jackson Carlo is obviously correct that the corporate body is not the employer and therefore has no basis to get involved in any sorts of negotiations. But in order to facilitate that transfer of information from that staff group to the corporate body, I've met with them for the purpose of having discussions and to give them some sort of outlet, because in the absence of that, the only other course of action they have is to go to 129 individual employers, which is not feasible or sustainable. So I meet with them and we discuss the position, and I relay that to the corporate body, and the corporate body takes that into account when it's making these decisions about which of the various indices to apply each year.
Thanks very much. I mean, I take the point that the corporate body is not the employer of MSP staff, but at the same time, MSPs obviously can't pay staff any more than what is provided to us in our staff cost provision. Also acknowledging your point, Jackson, that not all MSPs fully utilise the staff cost provision as it is. But at the core of the objection from the MSP staff unions, the three that wrote to the corporate body, is that the move to AWE does represent, in their view, a cut, but also that AWE isn't directly linked to the cost of living. It's relative to the earnings of other workers outside of this place, rather than directly related to the cost of rent, food, energy bills, etc. for the staff who do live here. So did you take that into consideration when looking at the basket of measures, and accept that any individual measure in any individual year can be deeply flawed, but that was perhaps an advantage of having the basket? Did you take into account the fact that AWE does not directly reflect cost of living? It indirectly does, but not as directly as a direct inflation measure, CPI, etc.
Yeah, we don't take the decision lightly. I mean, I said earlier that we feel that we should apply a consistent approach, but that consistent approach is not applied simply as a rote. We do look at the individual figures and come to a decision. The decision I think we took was that by moving to AWE away from the basket over the period of the last 3 years, that has meant that the increase to the staff cost provision has been greater than it would have been had we stuck with the previous basket of indices. And for that reason, I think we've decided that it would be appropriate, having made that change, believing it to have been in the interests of MSPs in terms of the overall staff cost provision that's been otherwise available to them, that we would stick with that for the duration of this Parliament. There's no guarantee that were we to now say we will switch back in advance of next year, that ash, which has proven to be a very unreliable index, might not fall through the floor again and particularly prejudice that basket if it was included again. So I think that what we have done, we feel, has actually been in the best interests of MSPs and in terms of the index that we have selected to protect the overall staff cost provision.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Kieran.
I was just saying, they should use CPI like they do for benefit increases. Maybe that would make life a lot easier for everybody. Okay, Michael, to be followed by Liz.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I wondered, touching back on the issue about the sponsored bodies commissioners on the SPCB, you mentioned about rising accommodation costs. Has any review in terms of the usage of the entirety of the parliamentary estate been undertaken, given the shift to hybrid working and the amount of capacity that might have been created in communal working areas?
In relation to utilisation by the commissioners?
Well, at the moment, in utilisation by parliamentary staff. I'm conscious that there are days when I walk around the estate and there seems to be large areas that are unused, or very few staff in them.
I don't think we've given consideration to the deployment of commissioners on the parliamentary estate. I'm not quite sure that that would be, well, I mean, it's not something we've ever considered, I don't believe. We certainly have consolidated, as you know, during this Parliament and last, the commissioners that are at Bridge House, and had further discussions about the potential deployability of that space for the inclusion of additional commissioners still, and there's some work being undertaken around all of that. We've even acquired, I think, additional space within Bridge House to try and consolidate those workings, because there could be further shared services workings between the commissioners still that could be achieved.
Yeah, that is not something we've given direct consideration to, although one of the commissioners, one of the very small ones, the Standards Commission, the staff are based in this building, have been for some time at no additional cost. We have intended to carry out an accommodation audit for office holders in the course of the next year, but that might cover issues that you've raised. We have been looking carefully at the usage of this building since the pandemic. Before pandemic, we were pretty much at capacity, but that's changed utterly since then. And we have been looking at the creation of more collaboration spaces because we have more people who are working from other locations, and that's been the focus so far. But there might be another stage which takes account of the use of freed up space for other organisations that the corporate body sponsors.
Okay. Might that be a suggestion or an observation you might pass on to the new committee?
Absolutely, yeah. We're happy to work with the new committee on that one. Yeah.
Okay. On the outline around the new projects, a replacement for the lobbying register, £500,000 cost. Do we feel that that's value for money?
Well, you ask an interesting question. Obviously, the corporate body's responsibility is to exercise the will of Parliament. And I am immediately struck, as something of a dinosaur in life myself, that obsolescence used to be people like me. The systems stayed the same. The people became obsolete and were replaced and worked with the system. In the digital age, it's the systems that become obsolete. And when we embark upon many of these projects now, we do so, I think, without fully realising that we are going to have to establish a digital system in order it to operate, and that digital system will have an obsolescence and thereafter has to be replaced. Now, I have to ask how many times I've consulted the lobbying register, and I wonder how many round here have, or how many externally have consulted it. It does seem to me to be a fairly expensive additional cost which Parliament has to incur, but the responsibility of the corporate body, whose responsibility it is to ensure that that facility is available, is to ensure that we have gone out to find a system that we can properly deploy, and that is what we've had to do. And I think we've worked hard to get what we think is the system that will offer us the best possible value for money in that context. But the broader context of the lobbying register itself is not one for the corporate body.
Yeah, I mean, we're at outline business case at the moment. We haven't signed off the final business case on that, and we've engaged with potential suppliers, but we haven't signed contracts yet on that one. But the $500,000 is looking like that's a good cost to get it in at. Bearing in mind what it needs to do.
Okay. It strikes me into my interaction with the system that it's a fairly straightforward piece of software, to say the least. And, IT procurement costs will be what they will be to an extent. I'm sure that you're going out trying to get the best price available. My broader point, I suppose, within this, I understand, Jackson, your point in terms of you're implementing the will of Parliament. I have no problem at all with the idea of transparency in this area. I was a great supporter of it. But is there any analysis being done in terms of the usage of the system and its efficacy at the moment as you're developing the outline business case?
I mean, we certainly have at the moment got temporary staff in supporting a backlog in this area. So there is a heavy workload that are in at the moment. Changes to legislation and the like have made it more complex than perhaps it once was. So they are. The system is not performing its full, the full requirements of what we would want.
But I think the value judgment, I'm not sure that would be one for us.
So who would that be for? Who would that value judgment be
I
for?
suppose one might argue it's post-legislative scrutiny. to some extent. You know, it's like any piece of legislation that's been implemented. The Parliament has the capacity to undertake post-legislative scrutiny. It would probably be some form of post-legislative scrutiny into what the outcome and effect of that piece of legislation has been.
So how many staff are operating this at the moment?
That number
We don't know. But that will be in addition to the £500,000 procurement cost that's
they would come
forthcoming.
out. So there's temporary staff in at the moment that we would no longer need if once the system investment has been made.
More automated.
Yeah.
But we don't have any indication of the broader behaviour change, both of lobbyists, parliamentarians, and better outcomes for citizens as a result of the legislation.
No, I mean, these are questions actually that the corporate body themselves asked when we saw that the project was going to be one that was going to have to be funded. But again, it's not for the corporate body to make these value judgments.
Okay. I suppose it might be worthwhile passing the information that you received, or in terms of the analysis undertaken to inform the outline business case to post-legislative scrutiny to act as a prompt. As I say, no problem at all with the principle. We want to make sure that it's effective as possible. Parliament's agreed it. But if we're seeing that there's a limited amount of traffic, or that it isn't encouraging behaviour change in the way that things operate, I would have thought that the post-leg would want to have some form of view of that if they have capacity to do so. Going back to that theme.
On this, and as with so many other things, Mr. Mara, my view in relation to this Parliament.
Okay, thank you.
List to be followed by John.
It's just one question, really. I mean, it's been very well trailed in the media recently that the cost of Edinburgh hotel accommodations in the inner city has really shot up very substantially. Not obviously includes hotels that members are using. I'm not someone that does that, but obviously a lot of colleagues do. Has that increased? Because in some cases I think it's sort of 30-35% with likely further increases. Has that been thought about within the members' accommodation expenses?
Well, I think there has been an opportunity for members to raise that issue within their respective groups to Andy Munro, who's been going round all the groups, meeting with them to discuss the scale and scope of matters that we might consider as a result of changes such as you've indicated. It also is a fact that for members in the Lothians region, I think it's been particularly difficult to establish office accommodation in the last two parliaments, and it's taken them significantly longer than in other regions. I think these are matters that we've realised are the case through cases of exception that have been coming to the corporate body, which partly underpinned the reason why we initiated the review that we have.
Mm-hmm. And have you been able to work out a sort of increase of these costs? Obviously, Parliament can't do anything about them. We have to accept them. That's the sort of market prices for office accommodation, hotel prices. Has that sort of percentage increase been built into projections for future budgets?
That will be picked up as part of the sessional review, which we're just about to undertake. So both the issues about Edinburgh accommodation and the pockets that we're aware of high prices for local office accommodation, they'll be picked up as part of that review.
Thank you.
Thanks, Convener. I'll add my voice to what Michael Mara was asking about, which was one of my possible questions as to whether the lobbying register is of any value whatsoever. However, so I'll leave that one just now. I mean, other departments like the NHS and GPs and all these people are going to have to absorb some of the national insurance increases, probably, because it doesn't look like we're going to get full compensation from Westminster. So I'm just wondering, was consideration given to the idea that, well, MSPs should absorb part of it and take a lower pay increase because of the NIC raise?
No.
Okay. Do you think it should have been?
No.
Okay. Well, by way of comment, I mean, I think it would have been worth looking at, but I take the point that 3.2% is coming up. But it turns out, I mean, it's 4.4%, and the convener already made the point that quite a lot of the commissioners as well, because of the national insurance increase, it is making the normal increases a bit higher. The restaurant Can I ask, does it use fair trade input much?
I understand it does. Yes, I believe it does.
What kind of products? Tea and coffee, obviously.
Yeah, for sure, tea and coffee. I don't know the details.
I couldn't give you a schedule beyond that,
No.
but the answer to your question is yes,
Yeah.
and I think that is one of the things that they
Yeah.
are conscious of and seek
Yeah.
to achieve.
Okay, thank you. There's reference made to making better use of the building, and some of that was maybe touched on already, but there's a kind of, I think there is a cost attached to that. Can you explain what that is? I think it's in Schedule 3, if I'm not mistaken.
I mean, there's spend on improving some of the collaborative spaces. So we're
The collaborative space, is that kind of hub area where you can just go in and get
and meeting rooms and the like. There's spend allocated to that for the year.
Right. Yeah, because it said, it was page 20, my Schedule 3 in yours. And I mean, are these spaces being used? Because the point's been made, they don't look very busy sometimes, but there's the big one on the ground floor just off the, I can't remember who used to be there, but...
Yeah, the old allowances office, the hub.
Yeah.
It's extremely popular. It's used by all the different staffing groups as well. So yeah, it's always busy.
Okay, thanks. Now, Craig Hoy asked about the shop salaries and things, but I see you're forecasting that their income will be down next year. Can you tell us about that? I know it's not a huge amount of money.
It reflects the trends and the forecasts as they see them. They're doing a review of the shop at the moment to just
because the sales have been going up in recent years, I think.
They have been. I don't think Christmas was as promising as they had hoped it would be. So, yeah.
Right.
Our visitor numbers have been recovering slightly to the Parliament since the pandemic, although we're still not at the pre-pandemic levels in terms of overall visitor numbers.
Okay. Now, on the accommodation, I don't know if you touched on this before, but there's a separate line for accommodation under the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman. Now, the rent there, or the accommodation cost, seems to have gone up quite a lot. I think you said 145,000 thereabouts. Was there a particular reason for that, or is it just the landlords being difficult?
No, that was the review of rent, which was based on the contract when the office holders were located in there in 2018. So it was a planned rent review. We just didn't have any information on what the result of that review might have been.
Right. And is that something that's negotiated, or is it just set by an independent party, or how does that work?
I think it's just set by an independent party, but I would need to double check that, what the actual process is.
Because it does seem quite a substantial increase, but that maybe touches on what Liz Smith was saying earlier.
That's in the context of very low levels for the first couple of years as an incentive to occupation.
Right, okay.
So it's probably...
Right, well, that would make sense if that's the reason.
Yes.
Yeah, fair enough. And on business rates, I mean, I think last year you'd estimated 2 pence and it was 6.68 pence increase. And this year you're estimating 2.1 pence. So is there a bit of risk there?
Yeah, there is risk. There is there. I mean, I guess last year was in the context of a much higher inflationary context. So but we've been reasonably prudent this year again. But so there is risk. We covered that last year through contingency, and we would do the same this year should it transpire that the final rates that come through are higher than we've budgeted.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much, and you'll be glad to know that has concluded questions from the committee. Thank you very much for answering. So, yes. Okay, so thank you very much. I'll now call a 2-minute break, then we'll move into private session.